We've discussed Freud's dream theory in a series of lectures, and it seems pretty helpful if we think a little bit about how we might try and apply that to an actual dream. So what we're going to do in this short mini lecture and those that follow is to give a dream, to describe it in some depth, and then do some free association and see what we can do by way of interpreting the dream in a generally Freudian manner. So let's begin then. This was a dream, it's my own dream. I had it on Wednesday, so that must take us to about, I'm guessing the 15th of September, 2022. It's about 3 in the morning. And I've written the dream down, so I will read that account of the dream, adding bits that I recall as I read. So I remember that the beginning of the dream is I'm getting a lift. Someone drops me off, and my sense is that the people who are dropping me off are kind of known to me, but it's a bit like when you're in town to do a conference or something and someone gives you a lift. So they're known to me, but not well known. And I think there's 2 or 3 people, they're in a car and they're dropping me off, and I get the sense that it's like 2 in the morning. I want to get home. They drop me off, I say thanks, I get out the car, and then I say, just wait for 5 minutes. I need to check I have enough money. I look in my wallet, and in my wallet I see a purple note, and I know it's some kind of South African currency. In South African currency, it's a 5 rand note, which is from my youth. Those things no longer exist, so that's from a while ago. I say it's fine. I've got. You can go. They leave. Next scene in the dream, I'm in a garage, and I'm positive it's not my garage. It's someone else's garage. And I'm rifling through stuff, and there's a shelf, somewhat elevated shelf, and the shelf is white, and I'm looking through things on the shelf. I see a bunch of things, but the object that makes the most impression upon me is a pen. But it's a strange pen. It's got like a double pen, and it's got 2 nibs, in other words, writing points, but it's tiny. It's yellow, and it's absolutely tiny. It goes through my head, this must be some kind of specialist tool. This must be some kind of inscribing tool. I'm looking at it, I have the thought, oh, should I take the pen? And then the next thing I know, someone is arriving on the scene. And it's a family. A family comes in, and they're about to sit down. And I think, oh wow, this is a wonderful opportunity to see what a normal American family talks about at supper time. They sit down, I see the father. Next thing I'm aware that also sitting down is Paulie. Paulie is a character from the TV show The Sopranos, and he's sitting closest to me. He looks a bit scary, and in his face, kind of on his nose, he's got like a double puncture mark, as if something has I don't know, punctured his face. This rather disturbing scar. He looks at me, and I try to be nice, and then at some point the father of the family puts his hands together, and this I'm not sure about. He either does this, in other words, makes a gun gesture with his hand and points to me, or he does this and he points to me in the dream. And I find it both a little bit threatening, but sort of a bit menacing, but okay. And I say, well, I should be going. And he says, you should stay. And I say, oh, okay, just for 5 minutes. And I sit down in a floral chair, like a real old school kind of chair. And that's the end of the dream. So I was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to speak the dream through and explore some associations with a class of mine currently at Duquesne University. We're doing a course, clinical approaches to dreams. And so I had a whole set of associates. The students in the class asked me to free associate to various bits. So we could do that. I could also offer 1 or 2 in the Freudian tradition reflections on the day's residue, things that were immediately in my mind because of the dream. So let's do that, and then we'll talk on about some of the associations made to the dream. So the first thing that was an obvious day's residue element was seeing Paulie. Now, not Paulie himself. I used to watch The Sopranos, and oddly enough, now that I think about it in the course of my own analysis, there had been some speculations about The Sopranos and Tony Soprano and the meaning of a father, all this stuff. So maybe one of our first more didactic comments here would be to say, well, isn't it interesting that when we normally think about dreams clinically, one would always want to read the dream in terms of what's happening in the clinical work. Now, I'm not doing clinical work as an analysand at the moment, but it's interesting that a significant dream still ties back at some level to what it was like to be an analysis and to issues that had emerged in that analysis. Presumably issues about having a father, being a son, being in a family, which as it turns out seems to be very significant in the dream. Anyway, so just a note on Paulie. But the day's residue element was I had been watching a film with my son, and that film was It, Chapter 2, you know, this kind of version of a Stephen King book. And in it, there's a frightening scene where we see a very elderly character, an old woman who's got a disturbing, in fact, I think it's on her chest, like a double puncture mark. Interestingly also, to follow that, 24 hours, day's residue comment back to something else further on as an association. I remember watching with my wife a TV show called, I think it's Pam and Tommy, or Tommy and Pam, and the character who was playing Pamela Anderson had a kind of double mark, and we were curious about what that was about. Also sounds a little bit like some kind of vampire puncture mark, but anyways, that's association to that. Other days residue, well, the garage seems significant. Not long ago, I moved into a new property, and my wife had said to me in a few days before the dream, we got to get the garage sorted out. And she herself was pretty keen on getting the garage sorted out. So that there's a garage in the dream doesn't seem particularly difficult to account for. That was certainly part of the day's residue. The inscribing instrument, I had started reading a book called The Night Watchman, and at the beginning of The Night Watchman, there's a description of how one of the characters needs to do some inscription, I believe, or using some kind of diamond tip, or it's all a little bit hazy. Funnily enough, I was listening to it on an audio book the same night that I fell asleep, so presumably that's where it comes from. The pen, well, okay, so those are some of the day's residues. Let's do some associations then. Right at the beginning, there is a car, people dropping me off. There's also the pen in the garage. The pen seems to be somehow significant because it kept on plaguing me. Why the pen? Why the pen? And my first association to that was an event that happened more than 20 years ago. Before I'd moved to the United States, still living in South Africa actually, I had an opportunity to visit an aunt and uncle. And I stayed with them in California, stayed with them for about 3 or 4 weeks, and then went to travel. And I was with them and I was writing, and I saw a pen, and there was a whole bunch of pens, and I took one, and I can't lie, I did take what I thought was a nice one. I was aware of what I was doing, and I thought, yeah, you know, whatever, it's just a pen. And then a week after I leave them, I'm in New York City or something, I get a call from them, where's that pen? And I'm like, what pen? The silver pen! My buddy Louis had this pen and it had great sentimental value to me. So that part of the dream doesn't seem to be particularly well disguised, but it was interesting that the guilt that I still carry about taking, I suppose, stealing a pen that wasn't mine, seems to have found its way into the dream. And when we discussed it in the class and students asked me to associate to the pen, we got there pretty quickly. But here's another Freudian note. Why the tininess of the pen? Lots of things we could say about that, but one of the comments Freud makes about those formal features of the dream, and in some of the lectures we've really tried to emphasize this idea, it's not just the contents that are significant, the contents in as much as that they are the manifest, disguised versions of latent ideas. It's not just the contents, but the form of the dream is important. And that follows on not just to how the dream ends, how the dream begins, is the dream in color, all of those things, but to the formal features of what is represented. So you could say that this continually emphasized point of the tiny, tiny pen, don't get all Freudian on me, interpreting phallic symbols now, what does that mean? So one of Freud's ideas, and you see this very clearly in how he thinks about the Wolfman's famous dream, is that there's reversal. And so if the pen is tiny, one way of interpreting that is to say that the pen is huge, or that the significance of the pen is huge. So as students were asking me questions, one way of understanding the tininess of the pen through this notion of reversion into its opposite is that there's something large about the pen. And my best guess is that the something large about the pen is an ongoing sense of guilt about taking the pen. So we can make another further point before moving on to other aspects of the dream. We've already said in a more didactic point that what the dream is conveying, what's happening in the dream, often tells us something very significant about the treatment and about the course of what's happening in the psychoanalysis that the person's involved with. We could also say, though, that the dream is telling us something very significant from the past of the person. And as I've already mentioned, this is some clear unresolved element, you could say. The guilt still seems to me fresh of something that happened 20 years ago, but is still in the dream. So we could say that the dream is not only a way of helping us think about what's pertinent in the clinical work, but also helping us to explore facets of the past that the person in clinical work may not necessarily volunteer. So there's that. And of course, to add on to that, we should always bear in mind the possibility of a type of reversal in the dream content and in the dream form. A very small pen might mean that it is rather significant. Interestingly, the other element that I remembered about the pen was that it was yellow. And pressed to associate to that, my first association was a yellow screwdriver. My favorite yellow screwdriver, don't look at me funny, I know what you're thinking. My favorite yellow screwdriver in the garage that needs to be fixed up and where I was busy doing some work in the summer. And so I think what we're seeing here is a kind of condensation, right? To go refer back to the Freudian terminology that we've dealt with a little bit before, that we have something in the dream which stands for more than one thing, where there's a kind of condensation. Both this yellow pen seems to signify potentially a pen that itself implies something about guilt, and also a yellow screwdriver, which reminds me of something that's pretty much in the day's residue, something that's important at the moment. And of course, the point to be made about that is, as we know for Freud, you need, for a dream to work, you need the previous day's residue, a fresh thought, which can be a mechanism of condensation that can be utilized as the vehicle to access another idea or train of thought altogether. So I think that's a nice way of thinking about what this screwdriver, which the pen was, which was also a screwdriver, condenses two different signifiers or two different trains of thought. The other point we could make is we would always want to think about in terms of a dream, does it give us, particularly at the beginning of a treatment, does it give us some kind of diagnostic direction or indication? And immediately you can see that if it is true that a significant facet of the dream is linked to guilt, you could say that guilt is generally the thumbprint, the fingerprint, the index of some kind of obsessionality. Not only, of course, there could be multiple different types of structures would evince a form of guilt, but that pronounced ongoing guilt of that sort starts to sound as if it does pose the question of obsessionality. So those are just a few opening salvos, a few opening comments on the dream and some initial stabs at interpretation. Let's stop there, and in the second part of this talk, we will move on to think about certain other facets of the dream and where else we might go with the Freudian approach.